Hi, everybody. I am Robin Landau, Director of Programming at Voices of Hope. And before we get started, I just would like to take a moment to honor the lives lost and the heroism on display on this day in 2001. If we could just take a moment and remember. Thank you. May the memories of those who perish be a blessing. Now to get into tonight's program, we are very excited to be co-sponsoring this program with the Mandel JCC. Since October 7th, Jewish writers and writers who write about Jewish topics have come under harsh criticism and suffered harassment on social media, have been disinvited from literary events, and have been deplatformed. This past spring, a Google spreadsheet asking, "Is your favorite author a Zionist?" went viral. The post categorized authors into groups including pro-Israel / Zionist, pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist. It's complicated and both sides sing it. And then called on readers to boycott any books written by possible Zionists. Today's demonization of Jewish and Zionist authors is the 21st century's equivalent to the 1933 book burnings executed in 34 university towns and cities by Nazi student groups, with the justification that said books were, quote, un-German. As we come together to discuss tonight's book, we do so with the resolve to combat anti-Semitic censorship and give a platform to those voices that people are trying to silence. We do so through programs like tonight's and through Voices of Hope's and the Mandel JCC's proud partnership with the Jewish Book Council. Through tonight's conversation with R. Derek Black, author of The Klansman's Son, My Journey from White Nationalism to Antiracism, we will explore how respectful conversation and the broadening of our communities can effectuate change. Derek is a doctoral student in history at the University of Chicago. Since 2016, they have spoken to many audiences at universities, foundations, institutions, museums, synagogues, and churches, and they were honored with the first Elie Wiesel Award given by the Wiesel family after the Nobel Peace Laureate's passing. And Derek also received a humanitarian award from the Anti-Defamation League. This is their first book. There will be time for questions at the end of the program. Please put any questions in the chat to Kathy Fishman, and please join me in welcoming Derek Black. Hi, Derek.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Derek, why don't we start with you telling us all about your background, where you came from, your family and your childhood, up until you started college?
Yeah, I grew up in South Florida, which I think the physical location of almost everything that has happened in my life always felt very important. I always tried to emphasize it in the book, and I think throughout anyone's life, it's like physical location plays a big role. And so I grew up in a quite racially diverse area. It was not rural Arkansas. It was not a compound. It was not a place where all the white nationalists lived together. It was a neighborhood my great grandparents had moved to. It was the highest per capita Jewish population in the world outside of Israel at the time. I grew up going to school until I was 9 years old. And at that point, most of my friends were either Hispanic or Black or Jewish. And one of the main reasons that my family took me out of school, but they had already been building the white nationalist movement for decades by the time that I was born. They had me later in life, and I don't think they expected me. They had gotten married later. They had known each other since they were in their teens and 20s, though, within this movement. They'd met in the 1960s when they independently became involved in white nationalism and really became major activists who shaped it over the last 50 years. And so when I was born, it was very clear that this was the center of their life. And as I felt sort of like an only child, I had two half siblings, but I was growing up sort of alone in the household, and I really leaned into their movement world, going to conferences, speaking, presenting their movement on major journalism from the time I was 10 years old, and creating a white nationalist kids webpage, and sort of creating a life that continued for the decade after that until I went to college.
Can you tell us what you believed as a white nationalist and how that is different than, or how you felt that it was different than white supremacy?
hmm So I always think it's important to, when we're defining terms, to remember that terms within this movement, and I presume most movements, when we're looking at like a social cause, they came up with their own terms, and they do that trying to advance a cause. And so my I chose to refer to it as white nationalism because that's the term that my dad popularized. It was the one that people within this movement would recognize, but it was also one that I thought people shouldn't be too easily mistaken as being mainstream or normal. I don't think white nationalism doesn't sound like the kind of thing that I think people might mistake for something that feels moderate. And it's important to note that nationalism is not the patriotism. It's not like pro-America or something. It's a nation that thinks about race. Another term for it is white power, but collectively, the main point is that it's a social movement. It's a movement of tens of thousands of people. It is deeply internationally connected. It's decentralized, so there's not membership organizations usually, but there's this strong sense of common origin, common goals. People have they know, they learn stories from over the decades. They have a theory of change. There are things that people are trying to advance over decades, and you'll see these sort of emergences of this movement and rallies or protests or court cases or political movements. And people often look back on that and they think of them as sort of individual emergences, like thinking there'll be major publicity around something like the Nazi March on Skokie in the 1970s and the Supreme Court case that followed up on it, or there will be decades later a lot of attention on Charlottesville, and it's easy for people not to recognize that this is the same movement. It's one that coalesced. It's one that sees itself as being a big umbrella for a lot of different white supremacist ideologies, and it's one that's different from just racism. It's not just independent expressions of racism. It's a movement that comes out of a world that is deeply unequal, where white supremacy exists in the social fabric that they grew up in, but what they created is something that is different. It's something that is very individual and personal.
And what are some of the
Right.
cornerstones of their beliefs?
So white nationalism is fundamentally based in this idea of biological race. Like you can look at it and it will essentially be identical to 19th century phrenology. It would tell you about, they believe that race is something that predicts crime and IQ and creativity and artisticness. Like it's something that they believe defines humanity on this fundamental level. And so their movement is therefore based on this idea of global segregation. Like they want nothing less than a global revolution. They want to overthrow states and the order of the world. And they view themselves as being the sort of victims of multiracialism and integration. And it is no less fundamental to their ideology to understand that anti-Semitism just underlays it. I think I often end up in spaces where it feels like the audiences are always divided into either an audience that is primarily interested in the anti-Semitism of this movement, or an audience that is primarily interested in their anti-Black racism or anti-Hispanic xenophobia. And I think it's really fundamental to understand how tightly those ideologies go together. They're really, anti-Semitism functions for them as just a type of racism, but it's one that explains their worldview. Without anti-Semitism, the their belief in a global conspiracy that every Jewish person in the world is involved in this like power struggle to promote anti-racism, to promote integration and decolonization, and like all the movements that they oppose in the 20th century, they none of their ideology holds up or makes sense to them. Like the forms of racism are different in every country, and they can lean into anti-Semitism as something that explains everything in the world. Without anti-Semitism, I don't think this movement would cohere in the ways that it has for almost 60 years.
So you mentioned that your family had been involved in this movement. Your parents have been involved in this movement for since the 1960s. Uh, can you talk a little bit about their involvement in the movement and a little bit more about what your father created?
hmm So my parents and David Duke were have been close their entire lives. They all met when they were teenagers, and David Duke is most notable because he ran for office in Louisiana in the early 1990s and won a state legislature race, even though it was an international scandal. And my dad and him had met when they were teenagers, both getting involved in the white nationalist movement. And then David and my mother had gotten married in college. And then after their divorce, my parents got married. And so the three of them have remained really close, both like as allies and as friends throughout their lives. And they had a real commitment to the idea that although white nationalism, there's no line between the violent revolution, people who are committed to just overthrowing the system and in any sort of action and violence and terrorism to get there. They were committed to this idea that they could win through politics. They could run campaigns. They could come up with the right terminology. They could tap into white racism and anti-Semitism in the United States broadly. And that was really the fundamental part of their beliefs that they part of their theory of change was that they needed to be the people who were willing to be called racists, who were willing to be called anti-Semites, that were willing to be called haters. And they personally thought they were getting the upper hand because as long as they could be marginalized like that, as long as they could sort of accept the role as being fringe and nobody's listening to you, they recognized that when they packaged their message correctly, they could get huge rallies. Like when I was a little kid going to David Duke's campaigns, I would see thousands of people coming out who were not white nationalist Nazis. They were just normal people who he could tap into these sort of latent ideas and amplify them. And that was like fundamentally how this whole movement worked. It was something that it felt like being on the inside, growing up within it. I was almost aware of the power of this in a way that it seemed like mass media was almost naive. Like people would interview my dad and call it a hate movement, which I 100% is a hate movement, but sort of like acting as if he was not succeeding in getting recruits. In the early 1990s, he founded the first white nationalist website, and he used media to launch it. It grew from just hundreds of people originally into tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people logging on every day. And after a point, he didn't even need the media anymore. It was just something that grew on its own, and it became this virtual representation of a movement that he'd been trying to build already up until that point.
So you were in public school until you were 9, and then you were homeschooled. Um, and then you're ready to go to college, and you end up. I mean, we're fast tracking this
Sure.
a bit, but uh, you end up at New College, which is an interesting place. And can you tell us a little bit about what New College was like at the time that you went there, and how, of all the universities or colleges in the country, that is the one you chose?
Right. I so I was never even sure I wanted to go to college. I like the kind of homeschooling that my family practiced was unschooling, if anybody's familiar with like the different types of homeschooling, which was essentially just let me learn what I wanted to learn and don't really teach me things specifically. Let me read, which is to this day amazing that it was okay for the most part. It worked out. I was able to go show up at college 10 years after they took me out of school, and I was, fine. I was able to write essays, and I had to take some remedial math, and made it through. But also along that way, I'd become a very outspoken activist. Like I really believed their ideology. It wasn't like while I was trying to maintain two sides, I always thought I was somebody who could be close to other people. I was somebody I made this compromise with myself that their ideology was true, and I was really working hard to understand it by going to these conferences and talking to tenured professors, and that I wasn't just believing something my parents had taught me, but that also I didn't think it defined individuals. I could be close to anyone as I wanted to be. This was sort of like a private compromise, and I thought I could have these two parts of my life. And by the time I was going to college, it was those two lives were just dissolving into each other. I had run for office. I had won a local office in Florida and it had become an international news story. It was the same year that Barack Obama won the presidency for the first time. And so I had gotten to this place where I couldn't have this personal separate life. Like when I had started a kids page for my dad's website, I had also started a personal page a few months earlier where I just like wrote essays about Spider-Man and tornadoes and things when I was 9 years old. And it felt like those two worlds were collapsing. Like it was this idea that I could keep them both was just impossible. And so when I showed up to New College, which the answer is like kind of straightforward, it was a school that was nonconformist and creative. It was a public liberal arts college in Florida. And public liberal arts colleges are very unusual in America. And I didn't want to go to the big state schools. I wasn't even positive at first if I wanted to go to college. Like I wanted to learn things, I wanted to read things. And so going to New College was a place that had a medieval studies program, and I wanted to do medieval literature. And it was a place where you could make your own degree, where you didn't have grades, you got narrative evaluations. Like when I got there, it was clear there was a my background was unusual and I didn't tell people about it, but the kind of person who was there was kind of weird like me often. It was people who were seeking out a sort of independent education in a school that had 800 students total. And so like people ask me, did you go to a liberal school trying to like get somebody to change your mind? And I explicitly didn't. I thought I knew what was right and I had found the facts, but I was open to people arguing against me. And more than that, I think I wanted a place where I could take a break from that kind of public intensity that was happening around running for office and becoming this like upcoming spokesperson for this movement. I wanted to sort of
Right.
step back for a minute and spend a couple of years reading books at a college. And I did not at first realize just how intense and how much of a controversy it was going to be that I was there.
So you talk about, you started your own webpage, you ran for office at a very young age, you represented your family or at different conferences since I think you said 10 years old. And you, you strike me that you were probably a pretty precocious kid, right? And
Yeah.
clearly very intelligent and very thoughtful. And during your childhood, I think you may have answered this, but did you ever question at all your family's ideology?
I think it's sort of complicated to look back on because like as an adult looking back, I have a lot of qualms and thoughts about the way, obviously the ways that I was raised and sort of the sense that my dad was always very careful to make sure he was asking me if I wanted to do interviews, if I wanted to go out as like a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old and like do these interviews. And he never stopped. It wasn't like I said once yes once and then I was like I had an obligation to. It was just like he would leave the room when journalists would come over to interview him if they wanted to interview me, so that I wouldn't feel like pressured by him. It was this sense of real independence. Like I was making my own choices. I was always free to decide if I didn't want to. Like this kind of feeling that he believed it was legitimate, that he believed was trying to give me an option, give me a choice. And I look back on it and I sort of wonder about just how much, you can believe that you're giving consent to your 10-year-old and how much
Right.
does a 10-year-old who believes the same ideology as you, are they actually, making that choice? But like the answer is more complicated than, that I like doubted it. I didn't want to be somebody who believed something because my family believed it, and
Mm.
ultimately you can sort of see where the story is going. I looked at eventually accepted like, oh wow, this is, just grew up in it just like everybody always said. But I spent years like going to these conferences that didn't look like what I think you might imagine a white nationalist event would look like. They were in hotel banquet halls. They had a big dinner. They had suit and tie dress codes. They had tenured professors talking about biological race and all this sort of pomp and circumstance. And I would go up and talk to these people, and I was able to really believe that I was interrogating it and that I had good arguments and good scientific backing. And uh, the parts of it that felt wrong were the parts that were more like emotional or feeling, because I wasn't willing. I didn't realize it until well after. I wasn't willing to look at contravening facts because I wanted to be a part of my community. But the times that it felt like a conflict were the times when I was realizing that I'm closing myself off to people, and I didn't want to be somebody who closed myself off to people. But also, I didn't, it didn't mean that I was able to say, well, okay, this ideology, I'm going to throw it out the window. I believe, oh, this seems true, and I have all these arguments for it. And it hurts that it means that I have to close myself off to other people.
Mhm.
And so I just tried to find compromises around that.
Right. I want to go back to how you chose New College. And this it seems as if New College is a pretty progressive school, right?
Mhm.
And when you speak in the book about your political opinions, before you change your viewpoint, you talk about it. It sounds like you had some fairly progressive ideology. You were against the Afghan war, the war in Iraq. You
Mm.
seem to be very involved in environmental causes. And so I just want to ask you, to me, these sound like progressive causes. And I would not necessarily expect someone who holds these beliefs to also hold white nationalist views. So,
Mhm.
first of all, am I wrong in thinking that? And also, is that a dangerous way for me to be thinking?
I I mean, I will reserve judgment on if it's dangerous. I do think that it's important that we kind of understand. One of the things I was hoping to do when I decided I'm going to write the book, because I waited years and years. It was for years I didn't intend to write the book. I didn't think it was useful to. I was already speaking out. I felt like I had answered the question of I can't be silent here. That's an immoral choice. But writing something in my own words with my own arguments, I didn't feel like I had something to say. And I also was very worried about just writing it for the sake of it or drawing attention to a movement I grew up in for what purpose. And my answers to that, the reason I was ready after the January 6th insurrection, was that this movement is one that is not powerful because it has like an army. It's not one that's powerful because they're revolutionary and they have the power to do things like that. That it's powerful because they have a pretty tight, cohesive sense of their ideology, and it's not alien to our culture. Like they all grew up in the
Mhm.
same society as any of us did. If you want to look at the map of like donors and contributors to the white nationalist movement, it would just look like the population map of America. It's every suburb, it's every city, it's every state. It's not, rural red states only. It's like, look at every northeastern city and you will just see a heat map of where white nationals are. I guarantee you work with white nationals, you see white nationals around, and they just don't talk about it. They don't
Right.
stand out. They disproportionately have college degrees and advanced degrees. They tend to have, an income enough to sort of take the time off to go to conferences like this. And they're not like mean people or rude interpersonally. They get along. They just hold hateful ideological beliefs about people broadly, but interpersonally they can be totally normal, and
Mhm.
nobody really recognizes that. And so those beliefs, those ones that I showed up with, were those are also ones I inherited from my family. Like my parents were atheists. They had condemned the traditional Protestant Christianity of their parents when they were kids, because they just they weren't okay with just saying, oh, I casually disbelieve in religion. They were people who had this sort of moral totality. And so if they didn't believe in God, they were going to condemn Christianity and declare themselves atheists. If their family raised them with the sort of, communal stuff about segregation, the sort of white supremacy that mainstream middle class white Southern people in the South in the 60s often believe, the sort of hateful prejudice they believe, but they weren't willing to sort of sit with, well, just like live in a segregated neighborhood and just, be quiet. It's fine. You can live segregated if you want to. It's not an issue. You can avoid all this. They weren't willing to accept that. They said if they believed that that was correct, then they needed to be activists for it. And so it leads to a lot of unusual, strange collection of ideas. And
Mm,
being on the far right, being radical white nationalist doesn't it's not the same thing as conservatism. Like
right,
there are a lot of aspects that are similar, but they also were very pro-abortion. They also were very pro the welfare state, but only for white people. They were very pro, having strong labor laws and unions. They were pro environmental protection, like these sort of things that it was sort of useful because I was showing up to a campus where most people were liberal or on the left, and I showed up and I did not talk about my background. That was kind of something that I was used to doing, but I was already prepared with a lot of beliefs that I could talk about that we had in common. I could talk about the prison
right,
sentences are too long in this country, and like we just don't. I just didn't have to mention that the reason my family was protesting the Iraq War was because they thought it was like an Israeli conspiracy. It's like we could just talk about the
yeah,
fact that we had opposed the Iraq War, and it would just be sort of fine for a while.
right. So what was that first year at New College like for you?
It was there was one semester that no one Googled me. Nobody recognized my background. I was getting to know people, and I was used to getting to know people, and I was also used to not bringing up my background. It didn't feel like, oh, I'm ashamed of this. It was like I just wanted to talk to people and find out what we had in common, and sort of I was always curious about other people. And at first, it felt like kind of how it always had. I was always wanted to be somebody who was open to any individual person, right? And I did not recognize at first just how incredibly different it was going to be to not go home at the end of the day. I was a residential campus, I was living on the dorms, I was getting to know people in a way that rapidly I was away from my own community for the first time. I was living among a different community who I was open to and found really creative and interesting. I was getting very close to people who were the direct victims of white nationalist ideology. We'd be sitting on the dorm room floor and people would be swapping stories about what it was like to have a Klan group in the town next over to them and just how terrifying that had been. And I would kind of realize, like, I know who you mean, but I can't say that right now. And I like those people, but I could also imagine, yes, they would hate you, and I love you, and like I do not have a compromise here that makes any sense. And it was this sort of like conflict that was building, along with the sense that once people figure out what I am keeping from them, this is not going to be like it's always been. It's not going to be a sort of a shrug or maybe shock, but then I guess let's just talk about something else that we do have in common, because this was both. I had gotten closer. I had become much more of an intimate friend. I dated a person who was Jewish on campus, and we had circled around it for the entire semester, and they didn't understand why I was trying to avoid it so much. But then at the end, we agreed, okay, we'll date for a few weeks before the semester ends, and then I'm going to study abroad the next semester, and we'll break up, and just be friends. It'll be okay. And it was like a lot of like 19, 20-year-old delusions, but I was realizing what's going to happen here is like people are going to feel deeply betrayed. And of course, that's what happened. I studied abroad the next semester, and then somebody did figure out my background, like post it to the student forum. And I watched all those relationships just sort of implode with betrayal. And then the wider campus, people who I didn't even know, having this enormous discussion for thousands and thousands of posts, just trying to figure out what to do about me, like how to respond to me, how to ostracize me, or is there a way to get me expelled, or is there a way to debate me or change my mind? Like, I was just sitting there reading these emails, knowing I was going to come back to a campus that was going to be incredibly different from the one that I left.
Right. Now, you also planted an article, right? Did you put so
Yeah.
you took an article about yourself and you planted it in the gym. What made you do that?
I mean, it was ultimately the article that the student found and posted on the forum, although I've never like gotten confirmation whether it was like that's how that happened. But it was before I left. I had this magazine that it was this glossy magazine that I had a big full page spread in, and I put it in the gym among all the other magazines because I just didn't know how to talk about it with people. I didn't
Yeah.
know how to bring it up. I knew that anyone who I explained this to was going to not understand, and I didn't have any way to explain it. It wasn't like they're going to say, "Oh, are you a white supremacist?" And I could say, "Oh, I don't identify with that term or something." And it's not going to be something that I can explain. It's going to be something where they recognize that I'm a good friend, that I'm kind, and all these sort of things that we're interpersonally close. But what I'm keeping from them and like what I'm saying in the world is something that they have expressed to me they find horrifying, like really harms their life. And I didn't know how can I talk about this, but I also couldn't keep living under the sense that this is going to happen any day. Every relationship
Right.
I'm building is going to feel so enormously betrayed. It was almost like I felt like I have to to move this in some way, and I can't be the person to do it. And it feels strange looking back, but it was like maybe putting a magazine in the gym was just some way to sort of end this pressure.
Right. And can you talk about how the different reactions impacted you, both in the beginning and in the long term?
hmm Uh, when I was going back and writing the book, I tried to be as archival as possible. Like, there's very few moments that I tried to retrieve just from memory, and I tend to be clear, at least if you're looking for it in the language. It's like, oh, I remember this happening, or it seems like this is how that person was seeming. But for the most part, I refer back to emails or refer back to pictures and journals and newspapers and things like that. And I was shocked, really, because I hadn't gone back and reread those threads in the over a decade since I left college and had condemned this movement. And I remembered it as being just purely hostile or scary or like something. I was like terrified of kind of coming back to this campus. And it was sort of amazing to look back and see that basically all the arguments that people that I then had with people that did lead to me eventually recognizing that I wanted to condemn this movement, all happened like within the first 24 hours. It wasn't,
Mm.
there was basically three camps. There was the people who immediately responded saying, okay, this is a transformative place. Everybody who comes here leaves different with a different worldview than they arrived. Why would it be any different for this person? They've also chosen to come here. Who knows, Derek, let's talk to them. There was the people who said, this is not a space. We are trying to create a campus where people who feel unsafe in the world, maybe even in the same town in Florida, we're going to create a space where they are prioritized and feel comfortable and included here. And New College failed at that a lot. It was a majority white school. It was a place that people like selected into and sort of created, like uncomfortable racist stuff in ways that people, always tried to go through and deal with. And it was a community that was always trying, though. And there was a real argument that we don't prioritize a white nationalist. We're going to prioritize the people who feel threatened by white nationalism. And that was real. Like, I found out after the fact that Hillel stopped meeting when I first came back, not because they were specifically afraid of me, but because they were afraid of the fact that I was so deeply tied into this movement. And they just didn't want me to be receiving the emails on the student list when white nationalism, which is the origin of most of the violence against Jewish community, was coming from. And so they like initially stopped meeting until they could sort of figure out whether they felt safe doing that. And people were just horrified. I mean, I was horrified at that because I didn't want this campus to be afraid of me. And people responding with like, give me the middle finger, exclude me, make sure that I don't feel included at any point. Like, that was a major reaction on campus. And then there was really just the people who were responding saying like, can't I just do my education? Can't I just like not be involved in this? And essentially they got kind of shouted down of like, don't be a collaborator. And this is what kind of happened for the next 2.5 years after I got back to that campus, was this kind of push and pull of a campus community that was up in arms about me being back, but that I already knew I cared about.
Right. So, in the midst of all of this, there are these people who seem to kind of reach out to you, right? So let's focus for a few minutes on Juan, Moshe, and Matthew, right? So to me, their outreach to you is remarkable. Both that they offered it, that these Jewish students and Hispanic students offered it, and also that you accepted it,
Mm.
and that you were open to it. So I'm curious, if you do you think if you had grown up in a place other than Palm Beach County, where you said had the largest number of Jews outside of Israel, do you do you think your story would have been different? Um, would you have gone to Shabbat dinner
Hmm.
when you were invited by Matthew Stevenson? And I love, I mean, it's one of the lines in the book that really stood with me was that Matthew Stevenson invites you to this Shabbat dinner, and all these other people are um, shunning you, basically, right? Like you said, giving you the finger on campus. And your quote in the book is, "I arrived at his room in the early evening before sunset. I brought kosher wine. I didn't want to be rude." So there's so much that I want to kind of dive into with this. So first of all, the first question is, do you think if you had grown up someplace differently, it would have been different for you?
I've never thought about that exactly like that. I think the answer has to be yes. Like there was sort of, I mentioned at the beginning, and it was something that is kind of a background thing if you're looking for it throughout the book, that I always really tried to emphasize where physically is anything happening. Every time there's
Mm-hmm.
a scene or a moment, if you're looking for it, it's like I'm always trying to make it clear, what room is this? Where is it? What is it in relation to other places? Because I think, where are we physically explains a lot about, our lives and our relationships to other people. And it's impossible if I had grown up somewhere else that I wouldn't have had a different life. But it wasn't until I was writing the book that I even recognized, just like I had thought it was strange a little bit how, I don't know, comfortable I was, was with the Shabbat dinners, or like comfortable even like that first semester. Like anti-Semitism is such a fundamental part of that ideology. And if I had years before that, I had like deeply anti-Semitic posts on Stormfront, and I had like moved away from it. And by the time I was getting to college, I had sort of independently condemned like their Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. It was something I like condemned privately without condemning their whole ideology. And it was something that I was sort of integrating into my life and trying to figure out how to do. And it was only when I was writing the book that I was looking back and I was like, why would that be? And the answer was because I just never at any point in my life did not know lots of Jewish people. Like it was not something that was alien or foreign. I always had, when I was in school, out of like 25 kids, like 6 or 7 of them were Jewish. Like even after that, when I was homeschooled, I'd be volunteering or going to like homeschool organizations, and lots of the people I was hanging out with were Jewish. Like lots of Jewish families in Palm Beach County homeschooled, sort of like similar to the way like some Christian families would do it for like religious reasons. And I always felt a little out of place with both of them because my family were atheists. But it was something that felt kind of obvious, I guess, in retrospect, but it was something I didn't recognize until I was looking at the book, that it was like, well, it's just familiarity. Like I understood Jewish culture and Jewish home life and sort of experiences of the Holocaust in a very personal way. And of course, that would affect me. Of course, that would make my individual relationships feel more intimate faster, I think, than any kind of relationship with people who I didn't know. And like South Florida extended that into other like lots of communities, like immigrant communities and Hispanic communities and Black communities. It was a space where people I always knew from the time I was a kid were just people on an individual level. And then because I was also committed to my family, I had to say, well, by the millions, the race predicts everything. But like on an individual level, anybody can be anything until you talk to them and find out who they are. And I think if people look and say like, oh, is there something unique about my experience that made it possible for me to do that? I think it was sort of that, maybe the commitment to not closing myself off to people or assuming I knew who anyone was before I met them, I think was something that is a choice. Like it's possible to go into any space, any community, and just not allow yourself to see other people, not allow yourself to see yourself as a peer to other people, unless you are willing to do that. And I think like that's a decision that at every moment you have to be, it has to be in good faith. Like nobody can reach you or talk to you if you are not willing to open yourself to them. And it doesn't have to be as extreme as my experience. I think it can happen in a lot of different settings.
And thank you. And what do you think made Matthew reach out to you on the
The
flip side of it?
I mean, it was a personal commitment. Like he had had family experiences. Like he's very open that his mother had suffered from alcoholism. And so he had grown up going to AA meetings with her, and he like knew people who had really changed their lives, and he had this sort of commitment that people can dramatically change. And he also knew that I had grown up in this movement. He was thinking like, maybe you just haven't ever been to a Shabbat dinner. Like, I'll come to this. Most of the people at his dinners were not even Jewish. It was like sort of a good community meal in the dorms. And also, I think sometimes it gets lost when people retell my story is that he wasn't some random guy reaching out to a random white nationalist. We knew each other from that first semester, not well, but we had shared study guides for a class we had. We had each other's numbers because of that. We'd sort of prepared for the final exam together. And so when I was coming back to campus, he was finding out all the stuff he had no idea about me, but he did know that we had been friendly. He did know that he knew what I was like interpersonally. He knew that I knew he was Jewish. And so him inviting me was not like, I'm going to be purely, at least, I'm going to be an activist and sort of change somebody. It was like, I know you and none of this fully clicks for me. And inviting me was something that he felt like he could do with some level of like certainty, at least about who we both were, that it would at least be some kind of mutual respectful thing.
So when I read your book, I was quite taken by who you are as a person and also by who Matthew is as a person. And I just wonder, and I want to ask, do you think your story is an unusual result of just remarkable people, like a remarkable group of people who happen to be in the same place at the same time? Or do you think that we all have the ability to create communities where these behaviors are more common?
I mean, I think both. I think that both of those are constantly true. That I a few years ago I worked at Facebook for a summer doing like a subject matter expert thing. I kept talking to tech people who were trying to figure out ways that you could maybe sort of create cross-cutting relationships and sort of like get people to de-escalate hatred or prejudice against other people. And I kind of always regularly had the response that like, relationships don't scale. You cannot scale in human relationships, and everything comes down to individual relationships. But the context that we create community is always intentional. Like people don't end up in a space working for common goals and seeing each other as peers and sort of striving for something just accidentally because they wandered together in the wilderness. It's like we create institutions. College is a very obvious one, and this happened in a college setting, but it's not just about being young. It's not just about that stage. There's all these moments where people come together and then they're among a community that they weren't in before, that they didn't form their identity around. They're now close to people who they didn't imagine they would be close to, and yet they're talking to that person, they're working together. And I think it's important to note that, like, not just, oh, you're like coworkers or you see people around. Like I said, white nationalists live in every part of America, which means they see every kind of person. There's white nationalists who live in New York City and are deeply white nationalists, and seeing people of different backgrounds does not change that. What changes it is feeling like you are equals and you are working together in a, under the same rules and for the same sort of in your individual goals, but in the same system, in the same place. Like that's what community is. And we always construct it. We always create it. It happens at different people's lives and different times, but it happens a lot. And I
Mhm.
think I just always just try to emphasize that we can atomize our society and make it much harder for communities to come together and see each other, or we can sort of create institutions that make it easier to do that. And I think it's one of the lessons that I hope people come from the book that I really wanted to emphasize is that I look back on this and I don't think that it was the experience was often like being individually debated in private. But
Right.
I look back on it and I see it as community. It was that I was open to a different community unexpectedly to myself, and it was that made me want to change. It made me open to hearing different arguments than I was willing. And I think that's how persuasion always works. There's a sort of meaningful feeling that comes from being connected to a community you weren't connected to, and then the arguments and the like, but is there a compromise here? Is there a misunderstanding? The sort of trying to resolve that is what we call like persuasion. And that happens after the feeling changes.
Okay. That's interesting. Thank you. Um, do you I'm curious how long the process took for you. So, I mean, you talked and you've talked tonight about how you made certain compromises with yourself, right? You said, and I'm gonna quote you again here. You said in your head there was no anti-Semitism or global Jewish conspiracies, no pro-Hitler, no pro-Nazi, no current or future violence toward or disruption of the lives of any Jewish person or person of color, no belief that race could predict anything about a person or on an individual level, no explicit belief that white people were superior to any other race or person. But at the same time, you maintain that white people were under attack, needed to be protected, and should have their own country. So if I'm curious if all of the above were true, right? Who were white people under attack from? And also, how long did it take you to kind of connect those dots in your head to come out the where you are now?
Yeah, and that's a quote from like a couple of years into the process. It was like this
Yeah,
moment when I had been back at school and talking to people consistently over in these sort of private conversations, and like those were the beliefs that I had come to, and it was this feeling at the time that it was like the next step was realizing that the reason I still called myself a white nationalist was because I did not want to lose my community. Like that was the next
right.
realization. And so like looking at that was sort of shocking because like that's essentially every belief that white nationalists have. And I had argued against it, I had disproven it, I knew they didn't have good evidence, I knew it actually harmed people. And looking at that and realizing, well, I still don't want to call myself not a white nationalist, even though I know it's harming people, even though I know I need to change. I know it was realizing, all along it was the commitment to other people. And sort of the end of that question was like the next step in it, but like there's a part of my experience that people sometimes ask like, was there a eureka moment along the way? And it's like
Yeah.
I think the closest thing that I had to that was when I realized that I had to say something publicly because I'd been so public and in the cause that the only way to really feel valid in my beliefs was to push back against it, explain why I didn't believe it, and declare that I'm not a white nationalist. And it was sort of strange to realize like that's the moment that it was very clear to me that everything was different. And it was also very clear to everybody else that things were different was the moment that I declared they were. And I think there's something pretty inherent in that about like what our identities are. It's like we are what we say we are, and until we do, we can believe a lot of private things, but it's our actions, it's what we declare, it's what we act on afterwards that really like
Mhm.
decides that.
Um, one we do have a question coming in, and I think it does have to do with the community and your family. And so someone asked, what was the reaction of your parents to your book and to your gender choice? And have you been threatened?
Hmm. Um, I, well, I mean, once I condemned this movement, like what is it, almost 11 years ago now. It was and it was really not clear even then whether my family was going to maintain any relationship with me. It was like the realization going in was I'm just going to lose every relationship I've had up until I was 21 years old. And that was essentially what happened. It was like walking into a void. But my parents made this choice over like this week of really hard conversations. They wanted to maintain a relationship. And that continues to this day. Like we have talk on holidays or like we talk when there's major family news. I've been back a couple of times over the years and it's always incredibly strained. There has not been a moment I've talked to them that they have not brought up their feeling of shock that I don't believe their ideology. I'm like the only person in their life who they know who doesn't believe their beliefs. And I think their response to the book has been like, they think it's fair as far as I know that I really wasn't trying to say mean things about them or be sort of harsh. I was really just trying to show what that experience was and how it looked and why people even like come to this movement and sort of how people change their minds within it. And gender, I think it's something that it's like there's not an enormous amount about transition in that, because partly it's something that's much more recent. It's like something that always existed in my life, but it's something that I have not experienced in a social public way until recently. It was like, and for a while, I wasn't even going to say anything about it in the book, and I realized, well, that's not consistent. So I talk about it a bit, but I think that's something that I've been a bit shocked, I think, at probably how crude, I guess. I don't know, like hateful, being the target of sort of that discrimination has been. And so
Yeah.
like TBD, I guess, on like what the relationship going forward will how it'll be affected by that.
Yeah. It's interesting because you talk about your parents and how you are the only person who they know who doesn't share these beliefs, right? And that kind of gets into this whole idea of expanding our communities
Hmm.
and meeting people with different
Or
different
I guess I'd say specifically that they feel close to and love. I think that they
right,
know lots of people who don't believe this, and they just like think, well, they just don't get it. Whereas they know that I get it, and I still don't believe it.
right, right. Um, I want to ask you quickly. I know we're running out of time. If other people have questions, please put them in the chat. But I do want to ask you about what's happening and what happened last year on college campuses since October 7th, because um, you talk about you're looking back on your experience at New College, and you write that you were surprised that the administration never offered support or even condemned white supremacy in a statement. And you talk about having a conversation with the first diversity officer who said it was a humbling revelation learning that it wasn't just Derek's presence, but the absence of an institutional response, a failure to affirm institutional support for community members who believed white nationalist ideologies to be an existential threat that left the community feeling unmoored. So I'm curious what you feel are about how campuses have been handling the unrest and what are the responsibilities of universities to their students.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that summarized the experience at New College. It was sort of strange to get out after it and realize how much things had been up to students to sort of build their own community, and the administration had taken such a hands-off perspective that it was almost neglectful. And my response, like, was that they just should have done more. They should have, at the very least, sort of affirmed the value of students on campus who felt unsafe, who felt rejected, who felt unsafe within their own campus community because of my presence there. And that's something that took a lot of years to be able to look back on and sort of contextualize and think about. And I see that in the same in protest now. I think there's a lot of spaces where anti-Semitism is allowed to have a home within protests. And I always try to be clear that I don't think just any protest of the war in Gaza is inherently anti-Semitic, but there's a lot of organizers who almost dismiss the fact that their protests are going to, from the very beginning, going to be a space where people who are advancing anti-Semitism are going to at least expect to feel comfortable. Like, anti-Israel protests are something that my family has glommed onto and has sort of used to advance their cause for decades. It's something that is very inherent to the far right and just any anti-Semitic movements in the country or around the world. And anybody who's organizing an event where they can't very clearly state exactly how they are making sure this is not going to be advancing anti-Semitism, is not going to be intimidating Jewish students, is not going to be dehumanizing people. Like, if they can't answer that, then they need to accept that they are in fact organizing an anti-Semitic protest. Like, it's, even if they personally, like, oh, I would never, if you can't, the way these things work is not about what you feel yourself. It's about how you are institutionally making sure that people are not being harmed by what you are creating. And I think that that's really a lesson that we all,
Hmm,
anybody who is in an activist
interesting.
space especially, needs to like really lean into. This is exactly how anti-Semitism works. It is a broad movement. It is one that exists in a lot of forms. It's one that's very dangerous, and it's one that molds itself onto political moments constantly. And if you don't have an answer for that, if you don't take that very seriously, then I think it's incredibly irresponsible to be considering yourself an activist.
Yeah. I think we're running out of time. I want to ask you one last question that has to do with your acknowledgments because, as you know, we are a Holocaust and genocide educational organization, and you thank someone in your book, Amy Siegel, and you thank her for you wrote who brought me into the work of memory and showed me what it means to stand behind the vow never again. So I'm interested in what you mean and what the role you see as Holocaust education playing in combating current day hate.
hmm No, Amy spent years after I first spoke out publicly. It was after I condemned my family's movement, I changed my name and I really tried to never speak publicly again. I swapped my middle and first names. I went to grad school. I just thought I had no space in public life. And after several years, I realized that that was irresponsible. I needed to speak out more, but it was something that was traumatizing to like relive, to lean into again. And I did not want to be in those spaces. I didn't want to be speaking, dredging it up. And this was about 2016, 2017. And Amy reached out over years. She was very patient. She worked at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, doing organizing events and education. And we stayed in touch. She invited me several times to things, and I would sort of beg off. And after a while, I ended up getting close to Alicia Wiesel, who is Elie Wiesel's only son, and we started, discussing and talking about things. And it was really talking with him where I was like, "So Amy is inviting me to these events. It feels inappropriate to me. What do you think?" And he was like, I think it's, I think it's safe to go. I think it's, if you're being asked, like, it's not really up to you to decide if you think it's an inappropriate. I think it'd be totally appropriate. And then I went, and it was really a venue where we were talking about both the experience of my story, but also the experience of how Holocaust education, I think, broadly is incredibly powerful. I think history education broadly is incredibly powerful because it gives people the some perspective on their own responsibilities in the world, without putting them in that place where they're like, "Oh, what choice would you make?" Because you never everybody is in a context and a society and a world, and it's not real to put people in the past and say, "Oh, you would be the good guy," right? But it is very real to look at the choices that people have made over time and just recognize how impactful every individual decision can be, and how being very clear about what your values are and being very clear about your commitment to other people and how precarious people's lives can be, and you can have a lot of power to change that, is something that, in the context of teaching how dark some of world history has been, can sort of empower people in their day-to-day lives in a lot of tiny ways that amount to a big thing. If you look at my
Mhm.
story, it's both contextual, it's a structure, it's a school, it's a state, it's a country, it's a moment, it's a movement, but it also comes down to individual relationships. And I think that's what always happens. Like, the people sort of ask, like, what can they do? And I always think the answer is that it's different for everybody. Everybody has a different point of contact, and individual relationships are the most powerful thing, like really the only thing that ever changes anything. You don't need to be somebody who's up speaking. You don't need to be somebody who's necessarily elected to office, but you do know somebody. You do know some place in your life where you can choose to act. And I think that that's the thing that I really look back on my life experience, that I think is the lesson that I try to take from it, is that it's a lot of moments that can be uncomfortable when things in our lives sort of line up and we have a decision about how are we going to respond to them. Like, what are we going to do? What is the value in us that makes us make the next decision? And I think history education is a great way to do that. Sort of like just thinking about our values is a great way to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. And I mean, I could go on. I have so many more questions and more questions are coming in, but we have to wrap it up. And I am so appreciative of your time and your insight. And um it was a really wonderful conversation. Our challenge to everybody watching is that we ask you to reach out to someone who you may not know that well, right? Invite them to a Shabbat dinner, a barbecue, a cup of coffee. Let's try to get to know each other a little bit better and build understanding through building community. We actually, I have a friend who she asked me to forward an invitation. She would love to have you all, not all of you at once, but she would love to have you over to her home for Shabbat dinner. Ronit Shoham has been opening her home for a while in an effort to grow her community. And if anyone is interested, you can email me and I will connect you, or you can send me a note and I will connect you. But I want to thank you so much, Derek, for being here, and thank the audience so much for this wonderful conversation. And I also want to thank the Jewish Book Council for all of their assistance in our programming, and Evie and Mark Checkman for supporting our speaker series. If you haven't had a chance to read The Klansman Son, I mean, you see, there's like so much to it. Mine is all very, very, lots of notes in it. It is available for purchase. Kathy's going to put a link in the chat. And then our next programs on September 17th, Voices of Hope in the West Hartford Public Library will welcome Heather Dune McAdam. She wrote Star-Crossed, A True Romeo and Juliet Stories in Hitler's Paris. And our next joint program with the JCC and Voices of Hope will be on October 15th at the Mandel JCC, where we are welcoming Lee Yarone, to discuss her book. She's a journalist, and she put together a book called 10/7, 100 Human Stories. Information about these and other upcoming events can be found on our websites, both the JCC's and Voice of Hope, and our social media accounts. The links are in the chat. And finally, if you would like to help provide more educational programming for the community, we hope you'll consider supporting Voices of Hope and the Mandel JCC using the links in the chat. And Derek, it was a real pleasure to meet you, and take care, and hope to speak to you again.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really great.
Thank you.